Well, thank you very much for having me here, and just being in the room next door and just being a part of the worship and hearing you all play. I feel often as a visual artist you can feel very lonely because you actually work on your own in a studio, quite isolated. And actually one of my favourite things to do is to curate an exhibition, because actually I think in many ways curating is bringing visual artists together and creating, like you would I suppose in an orchestral piece, pieces of music together, but bringing pieces of artwork together. And it's actually a really exciting thing being part of a visual exhibition and when you bring things together. So I had that same sense. A little bit about my background. My husband and I have been in Baptist ministry for the past 30 years, serving in churches in London and Manchester. Got 4 children, and I've always loved art, right since I was a little girl. And so I've kind of had a background where we've been involved in arts in our church. And once my youngest went to school, I decided that I wanted to train in the arts. And so I went and did a degree, and then I did a master's. And since then, for the past 12 or 13 years, I've been doing little bits. I've been a freelance artist, and I've been working in different galleries, working for borough councils. I've done some lecturing in university, just various different roles, community arts, lots of different fields in the visual arts. So that's my background. But actually today I want to share with you my dream, really, for the arts and the church, and actually where I feel God has led me. So I have a dream. I have a dream that the church will once again be known as a place of beauty and creative expression, of centres of belonging and love within the hearts of communities. The theologian von Balthasar emphasises the importance of beauty, truth and goodness in our mission to the world. And I think actually as a church we've been good at speaking on truth. We're very good at that, aren't we, at putting out truth. And more recently we've been re-engaging with goodness in the social activities that churches are getting involved in mission. But actually I think we tend to have forgotten about beauty. And I feel that we need to address this idea of beauty in everything that we do, in our worship, in our discipleship and in our mission. So there's a verse here: when we awaken to beauty, we become aware of new ways of being in the world. Now, by beauty, I do not mean the pretty, the pleasing, the easy to understand, and the mindless and the naive. But beauty, I believe, is the nature of God that can be found, discovered, and even surprise us in the midst of our everyday lives, even in the most difficult and harshest of situations. For beauty, for me, is the divine breath of love and grace that touches our hearts with a thread of gold. Beauty brings hope and life, aspiration, joy, gentleness, peace and goodness. It brings a taste and a touch of our Creator's heart, so that when we encounter beauty, be it in music, art, poetry, nature, science, the embrace of friends and family, or even in the kindness of a stranger in a moment of terror and devastation, that's when we encounter God. Beauty becomes a liminal space, a space of transition and a space in between. It's a finger that points to the eternal, like a finger pointing to the moon. The idea in this idea is often named in the arts as the sublime. It's a great quality of greatness, vastness and magnitude, of power and awe, being overwhelmed by something greater than yourself. It's a threshold to the divine loving embrace of God. And it is a moment when we in our mundane everyday lives catch a glimpse of the eternal overlapping in the present moment. So beauty is the product of honest attention to the particular, the universal, the human and the divine. It's that naked simplicity of the essence of life when we take the time to discard all the superfluous distractions that cause us to look away from the very heart of creation and of life. Simone Weil, in his book Waiting on God, writes, "The beauty of the world is Christ's tender smile for us coming through matter. He is really present in the universal beauty, and the love of this beauty proceeds from God dwelling in our souls and goes out to God present in the universe. It is like a sacrament." Again, Hans von Balthasar explains that the search for love and beauty is intrinsic to our human condition, and that as Christians, our mission is to build a culture of love, to change the world from the inside and to live as co-creators with the divine artist, to live lovingly and wonder at the unity of beauty, truth and goodness. And I just find this amazing. I find it freeing, I find it challenging. As somebody who's creative, if you begin to put that thought into your practice, if you began to think, what would church and what would my life look like if I took this statement seriously? If we built our lives and our families, our ministries and our church life around God's beauty, truth and goodness. If I spent time each day looking for these things, thanking and praising for these things, where have I seen God's beauty, truth and goodness today? Where have I seen it yesterday? And where have I shared God's beauty, truth and goodness? In today's culture, we have been conditioned to see beauty as glamour, stunning Photoshop models without a single blemish on their perfectly formed faces, or as expensive and desirable objects that create the perfect home in magazines and on TV programmes like Grand Designs. But life has actually become starved of beauty. Modern life has become quite ugly, mass-produced, materialistic, and always drawing our attention to the negative, the bad, the evil, the things to fear, the people we should be frightened of and hate. And contemporary art, particularly in our British art scene, has become obsessed with the language of the age, and art has become disturbing, shocking, reflecting the uncertainty of life since the 2 world wars. It's about randomness, life without truth and absolute. It's about life without religion and faith. And as our society has lost this faith in God and religion, so too it has inevitably lost its faith in beauty. For beauty is of God. So looking at and understanding beauty in the Bible would be another complete lecture. But I want to look at some beauty that I find in visual arts. It's portrayed in a multitude of ways, and visual art is just one of them. Here you've got, on the top left, one of Turner's stunning paintings. Turner's work is known as being sublime. It's that point that he depicts where light meets the ground, meets the earth, and it kind of creates an unseen boundary, a subliminal experience where the heavenly realm touches the earth, and it displays an aura of glory and beauty. That light. Then you've also got the exquisite icons painted in gesso and gold leaf from the Middle Ages. That sense of using gold leaf, just to capture that excitement, that passion and that beauty, that beyondness. They invite us to ponder on the love, the grace, the goodness and the holiness of God. Another artist, Mark Rothko. I don't know if any of you have been to the Tate Modern and seen the Seagram murals. Has anybody... well worth a visit. You all need to get down to London. Mark Rothko, he's a spiritual artist. He paints really large canvas, or painted really large canvases, and they are often seen as entry points into subliminal experience. That was his intention. Can you see the dark reds and blacks that he painted? He painted a set of paintings called the Seagram murals. They were commissioned for a restaurant in New York, and he was paid a lump sum of money up front and began to paint these large canvases. And as he began to paint, he began to feel as if he was painting a spiritual experience. He felt that he was painting an entry point to a spiritual realm, that by the time he finished, he actually decided that these were 2 spiritual pieces of work to be placed in a cafe, in a restaurant, in a city, and he donated them to the Tate Gallery in London. And as you can imagine, there was quite an uproar by the owners of the restaurant who'd commissioned him. He sent them across to England, and then he committed suicide. I don't know what you want to make of that, but it's they are a spiritual experience. And if you go into the room in the Tate Gallery in London, there's actually headphones that you can place where a musician has composed a piece of music that, when he saw these paintings, stimulated that creative passion in him. And you can sit in a room, you can put the headphones on, and you can listen to a piece of beautiful music and look at his pictures. And it's a real spiritual experience for you to do that. Rothko said, "I'm interested only in expressing basic human emotions, and the fact that some people break down and cry when confronted with my images shows that I can communicate these basic human emotions. Another of my favourite artists is Chagall. In fact, this summer we took a road trip right the way down to the south of France and stopped off at lots of different Chagall pieces of work across France because I just find his work stunning. He combines a lot of biblical imagery with the everyday occurrences throughout his long life. And this picture, the main picture on the screen, the pink one, is part of a series in the Museum of Biblical Art in Nice. And it's from a series called The Song of Songs. And he's taken, obviously, a passage from the Song of Solomon. And in this image, he has depicted, can you see in the centre, you've got like a city, an image, and it's a mirror image. It's like a city at the top, and then there's a reflection, a mirror image beneath. The upper city is Jerusalem, but the reflection of the city below, if you look, it's a slightly different city. And it's actually the city that Chagall was, or the town that Chagall was born in, of Vitebsk. He was born a Russian Jew in the late 1800s. And throughout his life, as you can imagine, being born not only a Jew, but in Russia at the end of the 1800s, he experienced exile from Russia. He experienced 2 world wars. And he was exiled many, many times in his life. And he always sought beauty. He always sought colour and celebration. And then these images that he paints, they're always full of strength and colour. And at the bottom here, you can see a wandering Jew. Can you see upside down? There's a figure with a staff. And that appears in a lot of his painting. That is the idea of the wandering Jew. You've got, it's not very clear on this picture here, but right at the bottom, there's actually a couple lying down, a man and a woman, in a wedding outfit. He escaped in the Second World War. He managed to escape to America just as he'd settled in France, and as the Nazis arrived in France, he managed to escape and get out to America. And while in America, just at the end of the war, as they were due to return, his wife Bella died of a sickness. And at this time, just as everything was beginning to fall back in place, he lost the love of his life. And he didn't paint for a year. Grief took hold of him. Eventually, he went back to France, and after a while, he remarried. And so within his picture, you have got his first wife and him included, and you have his second wife and him included, like the circle of life. So you can either see it as a story from the Song of Songs with David and Bathsheba, or you can see it as well as the way he incorporates the narrative of the Bible with his own life. And I just think that's a beautiful thing to do, to see the experience of God's story and the verses from the Bible, and then begin to apply that into your own life, and then be able to create something very beautiful out of it. His pictures are full of symbolism. He's also did the ceiling at the Paris Opera House. That is just stunning. A beautiful visual expression of music and art coming together. And music played a big part in his life as well, because, as you can imagine, Russian folk music was right at the heart of his upbringing. And he says, "Are not painting and colour inspired by love? Is not painting only the reflection of our inner self? And so is not mastery of the brush surpassed? It has nothing to do with it. Colour and its lines contain your character and your message. If all life moves inevitably towards its end, then we must, during our own, colour it with our colours of love and hope. For me, perfection in art and in life comes from this biblical source." Now, we don't know whether Chagall became a Messianic Jew or not. He always kept to his Jewish faith. He writes beautifully about his religious experiences as a Jew, and he often incorporates crucifixion images in his work. And when you read his work and you look at his artwork, I feel you can't help but understand that he really knew who Jesus was. Another painter, Rouault, whose images are often said to be full of ugliness, sought to portray humanity in its rich and rawness. A mother's love, brotherly concern, a prostitute or the circus player, he saw beauty and divinity in every place he looked. And he simply recorded the warmth of human values in the lives of those he met and tried to represent the divine presence in those places. He writes that anyone can revolt. It is more difficult to silently obey your own inner promptings and to spend our lives finding sincere and fitting means of expression for our temperament and our gifts. When we make art, be that painting, sculpture, music, poetry, prose, dance, it is our calling not just to see things as they are, but to see things as we are, through the eyes of Christ. What does he see when he looks upon a vulnerable and a broken soul? We need to put on the mind of Christ and see his reality, his truth, and not view life only through the eyes and ears of fear and anxiety that this world asks us to. To live in this way is for me the call of all artists, in fact, actually all people, for I believe that each and every one of us is creative at our hearts, for we were made in the image of a creator God. But for those of us who have discovered and practiced our creativity, it is our duty not to live life dualistically, separating the spiritual world from the material world. But we are to create beauty and to create liminal space, places where others are encouraged to pause, think, reflect and question life safely, and to make their journey from the head to the heart, and to encounter the God who dwells within them as well as without them. We're to use our eyes to not just look quickly at the world around us, but to really, really see, to take time to notice where the eternal is present and at work in our everyday. We should then draw others' attention to the minutiae of life, things that others wouldn't notice because they're always in a rush and they don't have the time or the inclination to look and see the truth that is hidden within our ordinary lives. For when we begin to see life in this way, it not only enlarges our vision of the world, but encourages others to step out of our small-mindedness and to look towards a greater vision, an eternal vision. It offers hope, transformation, healing and restoration. All those words that we read in the Bible, but so often find it hard to see in the present. And I believe that as creatives, we're to be like the Israelite spies, sent out into the desert and bringing back the fruit of the promised land to be tasted in advance. We are to tell the story of the promised land that is hidden amongst us, so that people out there can see it, taste it, hear it, and want it, even while we acknowledge the reality of the desert in which we presently live. And the arts give us an alternative language with which to share God's love. Instead of the words that have been spoken and repeated so often that society no longer listens to them, we have an opportunity to engage with the world through all of the senses, through sight, through sound, taste, touch, smell, languages of the heart that speak to our emotions, a universal language that crosses all cultural and age-related boundaries. And yet, what is the reality in our churches today? We've become, in my mind, stuck in the age of the word as the only Christian language. I've talked to many Christians and pastors about using the arts in their churches, and many of them are fearful and unsure of how to go about it. Some even feel that the idea is completely irrelevant or even idolatrous. For the past few hundred years since the Protestant Reformation, the colourful variety of creative expression that had previously been celebrated within the church across the world has been disowned and feared. It has been seen as the language of the material world, and a dualistic theology has grown up that has separated heaven from earth and told us that we are here on this evil earth to save as many souls as possible and then get to heaven. Now, the Reformation actually came about partly because of a recognition that the Christian message was no longer reaching people in a language that connected with them. The church in some places had compromised on faith and belief, and instead opulence, riches and power had replaced the language of humility and love, and decadent gold and artworks were sometimes created and understood as a symbol of the church's power rather than a way of communicating truth. We can understand that, But I would like to suggest that we're actually in that same position again. That in having thrown the baby out with the bathwater, we have now found ourselves in a place where once again the Christian message is no longer reaching people because we have limited ourselves to a language of words, a language of the head and not of the heart. But I and many others are sensing a change of heart and a desire to recover some of the lost arts of communications that Christians used to employ. In 1828, the dictionary definition of language was focused on verbal communication. It said human speech, the expression of ideas by words or significant articulate sounds for the communication of thought. But by the end of the 20th century, so just 10 years ago, the definition had changed and it now reads, any means of conveying or communicating ideas, a system of words or signs that people use to convey thoughts and feelings to one another. The use of language is growing and changing in our culture. And as Christians, we need to learn to communicate our ideas, our beliefs and our stories in ways that engage with that current culture. The contemporary poet Ben Okri. Has anybody ever read any of Ben Okri's works? Yeah, I do advise you. He's written a number of beautiful poetic books. And there's a very short essay that he's written called Beyond Words that it's well worth reading. And I'm just going to read a little quote from it. He says, "But the highest things are beyond words. That is probably why all art aspires to the condition of wordlessness. When literature works on you, it does so in silence, in your dreams, in your wordless moments. Good words enter you and become moods. They become the quiet fabric of your being. Like music, like painting, literature too wants to transcend its primary condition and become something higher. Art wants to move into silence, into the emotional and spiritual conditions of the world. Statues become melodies, melodies become yearnings, and yearnings become actions." Isn't that beautiful? And yet we often persist in still using words as argument to challenge and convince others that we have discovered the truth, rather than make use of the language of beauty and love that God has employed within his creation. The human imperative is to create. Earlier on this year, there was down in London at the British Museum an exhibition called The Ice Age. It had works of art that were 40,000 years old. These are some of these sculptures. Can you imagine 40,000 years ago? You know, we think of Christ, the birth of Christ as being a long while ago, when we think if it's 2,000 years ago, when you think of the Egyptians, but this is 40,000 years ago. That predates any of our stories, any of our word-based narratives. Music, dance, painting and sculpture were the first means of communication and language long before we had the written word. And this exhibition shows that all cultures use creativity as language. But they have found works of sculpture like this, works of art, buried in places all over the world. Archaeologists have discovered similar pieces from all over the world. They actually had a flute, a piece of, I think it was an eagle or anyway, the bone from a wing of a large bird that had been made into a flute, and they recreated the instrument so they knew that it would play. There was also a figure of a lion, part a lion's head and a man's body. It kind of proved that there was imagination. You know, this piece of artwork, I think it was 30,000 years old. It kind of proved that 30,000 years ago mankind was thinking differently. It showed that the divine imagination was present within humanity. For it is thought now that the only thing that separates man from the animals, man from the ape, is our ability to think creatively. For only humans make art. Only humans have made tools to paint and to carve. Only humans have skillfully constructed instruments that make diverse sounds, imagined and designed costumes and headdresses to embellish and decorate our bodies and create collective and personal identities. Only humans have written stories and plays and poetry that talk about our lives. Only humans have invented rituals and performances that are passed down from generation to generation that unite communities and tribes and give a sense of collectivity and belonging. The Old Testament, as you'll all know, is full of examples of creative acts. God asked Adam to name the animals. He asked Noah to build an ark. Jacob designed a beautiful coat of many colours for Joseph. And Bezalel was gifted by God with many creative talents and skills, it says, in wood, gold, silverwork and embroidery for the temple in Exodus 31. Miriam danced. Moses and David composed songs and sang. And we have the poetry of the Psalms and the love song in Song of Songs. And yet I have often heard the argument from Christians that the arts are fallen, evil and idolatrous, as they have too often been used sinfully throughout mankind's history. And yet if we take this argument to its nth degree, we can also say that sex has been misused, perhaps with far more devastating consequences, and so perhaps every Christian should therefore refrain from sexual relations. But we don't. We know that that's a silly argument. And we know that in its God-given context, that needs to be celebrated within the context of a rightful marriage. And therefore I think we need to be able to put that argument back when people say that the arts have been used in wrongful ways in church. I believe that the Western Church has suppressed creativity for far too long, and gradually a new longing is emerging in our digital and visual age. We've now got fresh expressions, a messy church, and lively contemporary music-based youth congregations with street bands and video notices. These new expressions of church have grown out of a dissatisfaction with the institutional and organisational approach to a lot of church life. And I'm really pleased that they are engaging with creativity in their approaches to services and outreach. But I'm afraid there is a but for me. For I am a little concerned that the art that is often being created and displayed is, although sincere and well-intentioned, often too simplistic. It's formulaic and decorative, and therefore holds little value or attention within the established art world. And let me explain a little bit what I mean. I think we're in danger of creating a churchy arts culture that utilises a Christian-only vocabulary, mimicking stylised symbols and limiting ourselves to predictable interpretations of biblical and theological themes, using self-styled eagles, rainbows, lions and sunsets, and embracing mass reproductions of old religious masters, of Holman Hunt's Light of the World, to decorate our spaces. We put posters up, don't we? We don't put original artworks up. We no longer commission new pieces of contemporary art to go in our churches. This kind of art that we do use might lift our spirits during times of worship, but there is so much more that we could engage us in our worship, and it's not going to engage our culture and make inroads into the contemporary art scene of the secular media. So this is where those of us, those of you here present who've been blessed with creative talents and skills, be they musical, visual or written, I think it's time that we stepped up to the mark. It is no good us complaining anymore that we have been misunderstood and excluded by the church, for we all know that at times that's been true. But we need to dream God's dream and demonstrate how God uses the arts as an expression of his love and character. We need to demonstrate a professionalism and encourage churches to take the arts seriously, to value them for the amazing tool and offering that they are, and to help move this often bland English church into a new age of creativity and beauty. We need to encourage and celebrate artists like Epiphany amongst you yourselves for stepping out and experimenting with new ways of using music as a language to this generation. I was privileged enough to spend an evening with Epiphany just this week and to experience their ministry and also the work that you do in art galleries, going into secular contexts and playing beautiful, high-quality professional music. It's just something really, really special, really, really important. And I think we really need to encourage those of you who are, skilled in the arts, be that music or any other art form, to actually go out there, not to be worried or frightened about using your skill, not to be trying to Christianise it, but just being willing to express what God has given you. We've also got a lot to learn from the secular arts world, who have overtaken us in the way that we communicate creatively. For centuries, the church was at the heart of every community, not only as a loving, safe place to dwell, but also as a centre for creative excellence and for the commissioning of new and inventive ideas. Much beautiful music was commissioned by church, and most of the art, the visual arts, was commissioned by church. In fact, it is said that up until the mid-1700s, nearly all Western art movements were initiated and commissioned by the church. That's quite something, don't you think? Nearly all art movements were. But since the mid-1800s, every single new Western art movement, from Cubism, Impressionism, pop art, etc., has been initiated not just outside of the church, but mostly anti the church and its establishment, until we're in the situation of today, where the church and the art world have become almost completely divided. So I want to suggest some of my ideas for the way ahead. I want to look that as churches, we can begin to learn the lessons about place and space that contemporary society are using, and instead of utilising them for consumeristic and capitalistic aims, let's use them for the good of community and the promotion of love. For example, you would all recognise here pictures of the Trafford Centre. This has become a temple of consumerism in our culture, hasn't it? The amount of time and effort that went into the design of this place. But actually, when I was on my MA, one of the things we were looking at is understanding place and non-place in philosophy and in art and in architecture. And actually, these buildings are designed today as what they call a non-place. Marc Aurègue, a philosopher, wrote this term. The idea of a non-place is a place that you journey through quickly, that you pass through quickly. Originally, towns and villages had a centre, didn't they? You'd have a sculpture at the centre, you'd have the church, you'd have the shop, you would have a place where people will congregate and where people would belong. And that created that sense of community. Nowadays, actually, contemporary architecture, if you think about how our towns are designed and made, they're actually made as places for you to pass through, because the quicker you pass through, the more you'll consume, the more you'll buy. If you stay in one place, you're not going to buy as much. So spaces are created no longer as places of belonging. Now, actually, can the church perhaps reconsider whether or not we want to recreate that centre of belonging where it used to be? How would you do that? How would you go about creating senses of belonging, places at the centre of community again? How do we use beauty, creativity to do that? We've got lessons to learn from museums and galleries. Got here a picture of the War Museum North over in Salford, just over the border. And I took my mum there a few years ago. I don't know if anybody's been in there to the experience. The experience there, it's no longer like a traditional museum, is it? When you work in a museum, or like I say, I worked in galleries, you no longer have an object and a little bit of writing next to it and another object and a little bit of writing. The whole point of curating these spaces is to create a feeling, atmosphere and a story. So you have to think, when curating a space, what do I want the person who's visiting to feel by the time they've left? That's what curating a space is about. You're creating emotion, you're creating feeling, and you're creating experience, because that's how we learn. You're creating spaces that engage with all the senses. Like I say, I took my mum along to this space. You've got projections going on the wall, you've got sounds, they have this film come on, and you sit down quietly and they replay the sounds and the images on the wall from the Second World War. Now, my mum was a small child in the Second World War, and she lived through the Blitz in the East End of London and was actually bombed out. Her family were bombed out 5 times. She's always said she doesn't have very many memories of it. You know, she doesn't talk much. And my mum's a very strong woman, and she cowered on the floor and said, "Get me out of here," because it just overwhelmed her so much. She said, "I never knew I had these memories." And being in a space that used sound, smell, images, just conjured up something within inside her, and those memories surfaced, and she didn't know how to deal with them, and we had to take her out. culture has learnt how to engage with our senses in a way that we used to be able to do in the church, and we have forgotten. So when I worked in a gallery, the buzzwords were access, participation and ownership. And I think these are words that we ought to use as keywords for church too. If you want to make a venue engaging, if you want people to come along, you have to make it easily accessible, not just physically so as they can get in the building, but the information accessible so as they enjoy learning what they want to learn. You've got to make it participative. It's the buzzword nowadays, isn't it? Everything has to be participative. So as rather than having it done to you, you want to join in. You want to feel as if I can take part as well. Because if you participate, you then begin to feel as if you own it too. You have that sense of belonging. You feel a part of it. So these, I think, are three really key words that we as creatives can use in church to help people engage with the story of Christ more. Access, participation and ownership. And the language has also been this in schools. Our daughter is a primary school teacher, and she spends so much of her time trying to think of imaginative and creative ways that she can capture the attention of her children. She knows what she's got to get through to them, and she knows that if she just, well, you don't write on a blackboard anymore, but she knows that if she just had to write something on the blackboard and tell them to learn it off, it would go in one ear and out the other. So she has to try to think of images that they can hold in their minds, and they can associate an image with a thought or an idea. We live in this age of experience. We, as I said, don't want to be talked at, but we want to communicate, question and experience life before committing to anything. We're in the age of TV, Big Brother and X Factor, and I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. All of these are television programmes where you join in, you participate, you vote, you take part, and therefore you feel as if the programme belongs to you. I mean, how many of you are watching Strictly at the moment? Are you a Strictly person or an X Factor person? You kind of own one or the other, don't you? Because they're not at the same time. Society is buying into these sorts of things. Contemporary art has also adopted this language. Contemporary art is no longer just an image on the wall, but we have installation art, we have performance art, it's interactive, and the theory that you learn is around the notion of the death of the author, Roland Barthes' theory, that the author is now dead as such, and when you read a text, you as the reader add to the meaning of the text because you add your context, you add your story, your background to the way that you read a text. Therefore, any exhibition, any artwork, any piece of music, each person who's listening or watching or reading will gain something slightly different. Therefore, the interpretation can be changed or added to. These are really important questions that we need to think about, because as churches, quite often we like to think we've got one truth, we say it and you've got to accept. Whereas though actually this means of communication invites people to think, to reflect, to ponder and to come to their own conclusion. Therefore we're inviting questions. So actually society encourages people to question. It encourages people to think for their own. It gives them pointers. And I think actually that's something that as churches we need to begin to do. And creativity is a great way to encourage questioning. Like I say, in arts, these are two landscapes. The top one you would probably all recognise, John Constable, a painting, a 2D painting that hangs on a wall, and you can go and see it and you can think this is beautifully, beautifully executed, a painting in oils, the detail is exquisite. But you tend to go into a gallery, don't you, and you have a look, you think that's nice, and then you move on to the next one. Now Anish Kapoor's landscape is beneath. This is contemporary landscape. It's in a sense the same thing as the John Constable piece, that this is a large piece of mirrored metal, placed, well, it moves from place to place, placed outside in the landscape. And the idea is that he draws attention to something that's beautiful. He is drawing attention to what's already there. You might have been walking and you'd have seen the sky and you'd have seen the land, but when you come across his sculpture, you begin to look, because all of a sudden it's a piece of artwork, it's a moving image, the clouds move, and as you approach, you become a part of the work of art. So actually you are beginning to participate in the piece of artwork, and therefore you own it, you feel it's yours, and you find people going up to them and moving and playing and interacting and calling others over. It becomes an interactive landscape, very different from a 2D painting on a wall. It takes the gallery out into the marketplace where we interact differently. It plays with our sense of place and our sense of nature. Again, this is something I think the church is beginning to do, isn't it? We're taking church outside the walls. But actually, how can we begin to do that more creatively? It's just another question. You've also got a piece of artwork here that was at the Tate Gallery, in the Turbine Hall. This was quite a few years ago now, in 2003. It's by an artist called Olafur Eliasson, and it's basically a sunrise that takes place in the gallery. Now, outside, the sun rises every single day, but often we don't notice it. The sun rises every day in London, and people don't seem to stop and look at the sun rising. So this artist decided to create a man-made copy inside a gallery setting. And because it's unexpected, it drew enormous crowds who just came to sit and be and think and admire and engage with the beauty of a fake sunrise. It's quite stunning, really, isn't it? Just drawing attention to nature. And as you can see, art in that way becomes a contemplative place. It becomes that liminal space. It causes people to stop, to slow down, to pause, to think, in a world that's busy and rushing around. Another piece of artwork by Anthony Gormley, who did the Angel of the North. This is a piece called Blind Light, made in 2007 as an installation in the Hayward Gallery, and it's a fog box. It creates a subliminal space. It's an interior glass box that mimics the environment of the top of a mountain or the bottom of the sea, where you feel that sense of aloneness in the midst of a crowd. A space where you can't make out what's ahead of you, where the unexpected will take place. And viewed from the outside, each figure becomes unrecognisable, almost otherworldly, ghostly and yet real. And it poses so many questions for us about existence, about feeling, about emotion, as do many of his other amazing pieces of work. Have any of you been up to Crosby Beach and seen his piece, Another Place? 100 life-size figures in metal that's in the sea, actually placed in the sea at different depths so as the tide comes in and out. They're all looking out to the sea. So what you want to do is look at what are they looking at, and they're just looking at the horizon. So it makes you consider and contemplate the horizon. His works are very powerful and very thought-provoking. Another contemporary artist is called Bill Viola. He's an American video artist. And basically, he creates moving paintings. He's actually at the moment been commissioned to create the first video altarpiece for St Paul's Cathedral that should open next year. And there's been quite a lot of controversy, a video altarpiece, we're used to paintings, aren't we? We're used to sculptures in church, but a permanent video piece, what's it going to be? It's quite a lot of controversy, but his work is absolutely fascinating. I don't have much time to go into it now, so I do encourage you to go onto his website, look up his name, Bill Viola, and see more about his work. You've got an exhibition in 2009 that went down to in London called The Sacred Made Real at the National Gallery. It was actually an exhibition of Spanish religious painting and sculpture from the 16 and 1700s. In Spain, in Catholic chapels, they have a lot of large sculptures, and on Holy Week they bring them out of the church and they have the parades in the streets with the big floats, and it's a very, very big festival. So what the gallery did was they took those religious works of art out of the religious spaces and put them in the gallery, in the National Gallery, and they had 5,000 visitors a day on average. It was one of their best attended exhibitions ever. We sometimes think that religious art is not popular, but how come that happened? And the reason was, I just think, is that the emotion and the feeling that it induced when you went into these spaces, it was a spiritual experience. People walking around the gallery were quiet and meditative, and some were prayerful. And this is a beautiful sculpture. It's by an artist called Juan Martine Montane, and it's a sculpture created to induce worship. For it hangs at the front of a church, and it's made to look as if Christ is asleep or dead on the cross. It's kind of at the end, isn't it? It's that it is finished and it's the end. But if you actually walk up to it and you decide not just to look, but you decide to make an act of worship, if you go and kneel at the foot of this crucifix and you look up, you meet the eyes of Christ, for they're open. But they're open and they catch your gaze, but they only catch your gaze when you kneel at the foot of the cross. It's a really powerful piece of artwork, I say, created to induce prayerful worship. He holds your gaze, and you sense intensely that this act that Christ did was for you personally, that his love is for you personally, and that he has suffered and endured more than you ever have and ever will, and that he still looks at you with the eyes of love at this most crucial moment. It's a very moving and sublime piece. Another exhibition that they had in 2000 was called Seeing Salvation. Again, incredibly moving and sublime. This is a painting in a similar ilk of Christ embracing St. Bernard as Christ comes down from the cross. In this image, you can't actually see the cross because it's actually too dark. If you see the actual painting, you can see the image of the cross there. But this is kind of a play with time, because we know that as Christ came down from the cross, he was dead. But it's kind of, art can bring in all moments, can't it, to tell the story it wants to tell. So in this you have the resurrected Christ leaving the cross, and as he comes down from the cross, he is intimately engaging with St. Bernard. He's loving him, he's embracing him. He's still wounded, but it kind of wraps up the eternal in the present moment. It brings earth and heaven together in one moment. There's many, many ways that art can engage with us spiritually. In fact, it has been suggested that the gallery and the museum has replaced the church of places of contemplation, meaning and subliminal experience. I think it's time we reverse this trend. So I want to end my talk with another quote from the poet Ben Okri. It's a long quote, but I just really think it sums up everything that we've been saying. It's called The Dancer. A flamenco dancer, lurking under a shadow, prepares for the terror of her dance, for somebody has wounded her with words, alluding to the fact that she has no fire or duende. She knows she has to dance her way past her limitations, and that this may destroy her forever. She has to fail, or she has to die. I want to dwell for a little while on this dancer because, though a very secular example, she speaks very well for the power of human transcendence. I want you to imagine this frail woman. I want you to see her in deep shadow and fear. When the music starts, she begins to dance. With ritual slowness, she stamps out the dampness from her soul. Then she stamps fire into her loins. She takes on a strange, enchanted glow. With a dark, tragic rage, shouting, she hurls her hungers, her doubts, her terrors, and her secular prayer for more light into the spaces around her. All fire and fate, she spins her enigma around us and pours into the awesome risk of her dance. She is taking herself apart before our sceptical gaze. She is disintegrating, shouting, stamping, and dissolving the boundaries of her body. Soon she becomes a wild, unknown force, glowing in her death, dancing from her wound, dying in her dance. And when she stops, strangely gigantic in her new fiery stature, she is like one who has survived the most dangerous journey of all. I can see her now as she stands shining in celebration of her own death. In the silence that follows, no one moves. The fact is, she has destroyed us all. Why do I dwell on this dancer? I dwell on her because she represents for me the courage to go beyond ourselves. While she danced, She became the dream of the freest and most creative people we had always wanted to be in whatever it is we do. She was the sea we never ran away to, the spirit of wordless self-overcoming we never quite embrace. She destroyed us because we knew in our hearts that rarely do we rise to the higher challenges in our lives or our work or our humanity. She destroyed us because rarely do we love our tasks and our lives enough to die and thus be reborn into the divine gift of our hidden genius. We seldom try for that beautiful greatness brooding in the mystery of our blood. You can say in her own way and in that moment that she too was a dancer to God. That spirit of the leap into the unknown, that joyful giving of the self's powers, that wisdom of going beyond in order to arrive here, that too is beyond words. All art is a prayer for spiritual strength. If we could be pure dancers in spirit, we would never be afraid to love, and we would love with strength and wisdom. We would not be afraid of speech, and we would be serene with silence. We would learn to live beyond words amongst the highest things. We wouldn't need words. Our smile, our silences would be sufficient. Our creations and the beauty of our functions would be enough. Our giving would be our perpetual gift. We, in my mind, as Christians, creatives, are this dancer, misunderstood and sometimes broken by words spoken over us by the church. But we need to dance. This is our challenge. Can we dance despite our vulnerability and our fears? Can we dance alongside one another and tentatively discover new ways of expressing beauty, create spaces and places that act as thresholds to the hidden realms of the promised land, the eternal realm that is already present amongst us? Can we dare to rise up and offer a new voice, a silent voice, without words, a voice of beauty, of poetry, of music, of painting, of sculpture, of installation? Can we allow the creative presence of the Holy Spirit to overflow through our being and into everything around us? It is an adventure, but one I believe that we can make together. Thank you.